And then, okay, I have a slightly updated outline too, which I'll drop in
Oh,
the.
right.
Can I
Okay.
just drop that in the chat, or do I need to send you an email?
E probably has to be email,
Oh yeah,
unfortunately.
that's right. You're on your phone. Yeah. Okay. One second. Okay. No, I'm sending it to you, not me. Okay, there we go. I didn't change much, but I did clarify a few things that were not very clear or obvious in the outline that
Uh-huh.
I sent you like a week ago or so.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know, maybe we can just like kind of go through this. There's a lot of stuff. I don't know if we can get through all of Fichte and Hegel in one session, but we'll try.
Yeah. Yeah, we can just go through the outline. I did see like some stuff that was outside of the chapter two that you added that I actually don't have any background. Um, but
Yeah,
so
but
yeah.
that's fine. We can go over some of that.
I've been sort of intimidated by Hegel for some reason.
Well, he's not easy to read.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of good secondary literature on his two big works, the Phenomenology of Spirit and Science of Logic.
Hmm.
And so that makes it a little bit easier. I think honestly the kind of story that he tells is not that complicated.
Mm.
His language is extremely complicated and extremely detailed and
Mm.
long-winded. Um, but I also kind of think that probably the best way for any of these people, really the best way to understand and then kind of come into a developing whatever dialogue or conversation or just deeper understanding with is to try to reason through the things yourself,
Hmm.
right? Because then I don't know, it's something about um, why, for instance, I don't know if you're doing math problems or I guess anything really, if you just get the answer, it's easy to forget even if you understand it. But if
Yeah.
it's an answer that you worked for that you tried multiple strategies to discover, then for whatever reason it sticks better.
Yeah.
And you don't always necessarily need to, for one thing, read the original text right away for that. Um, Usually, secondary literature is pretty good at introducing the basic themes and problems and that kind of thing. And then you can start to take that and think about it yourself. And the original texts are good for detail,
Mm.
um, and also to kind of check if an interpretation fits with the actual language that the author uses or whatever.
Yeah.
That can be kind of difficult because in order to feel really confident about that, I guess you have to read everything and be very fluent with it, everything they wrote, because
Right.
uh, they may develop ideas in a slightly different way in other places, but for the most part, I think it's best just to think about these questions that are raised by these people yourself and see if you can either one, figure out how they got to the conclusions they got to, or see if there are places that not necessarily that they go wrong, but that the the arguments could potentially yield. Anyway, okay. Well, what do you remember about Fichte?
Wait, we're doing chapter 12, right?
Well, we didn't talk about Fichte at all, and there are a couple of important things in that.
Oh,
Um,
we didn't. Okay.
so then it's probably been like 3 weeks since you read this one.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh,
That's fine.
we did a chapter 11. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. The reason I want to do this one is that I think the payoff is pretty big. for
Mm,
this, because of the way it touches on questions like autonomy and aesthetics with respect to the infinite judgment. Um, and
hmm.
so I think that it's also not that difficult. I think the Hegel chapter is probably more difficult. But
Yeah,
do you remember anything about Fichte? We can start
I
with
think
that.
I think the proposition I am, which is left open-ended without um, attributing any predicates to it, is sort of like say the ground or um, the first sort of principle or something,
Hmm.
or let's say subjectivity um, or the root. I guess like that's like the first thing that you need, like the self-awareness of like self-consciousness or that, you know.
Yeah, so that's
Um,
that is one thing that Fichte says that Maimon was already critiquing Kant from a similar perspective, this idea that the transcendental philosophy needs some kind of unified first principle.
mhm,
Um, and it is true that Fichte expresses that unified first principle in terms of I am.
mhm,
But how does he get to I am as the formulation of that first principle? I mean, we've already laid out the steps last time, if you remember. I mean, uh, according anyway to this book, the steps to expressing I am as the first principle of philosophy are already found in Maimon.
mm,
And I think that there are really two important things. One is how you can formulate the infinite judgment um, as a positive sentence that has some similarities to what we would now call a category mistake,
mhm,
right? And what's going on in the relationship between the subject and the predicate in a category mistake that makes it a category mistake instead of just something that's false, or in fact, actually something that's true, but trivially true. Like
mhm,
if I say that happiness is not a banana, that's true, but it's
mhm,
also a category mistake. Or,
mhm,
virtue is not quadrilateral is true, but it's not adequate to just call it true. There's something more about it. So that's one part
mhm,
of it. And then the other part of it was to look at this idea of what you might call self-predication in the subject as itself already a synthesis.
mhm.
You remember anything about that?
Yeah, so well, I guess like for a synthesis, you need a subject and a predicate, like
Hmm.
generally speaking. But when you just posit um, I or I am, um, there seems to be like some sort of a unity, primordial unity or something that in that unity already there is a synthesis
Hmm.
where
Yeah,
the subject is formed.
yeah. You need to work in the word determination or determinability into
Mhm,
your explanation because that's really the key.
right.
In what sense does the subject stand on its own as itself a kind of unified synthesis? And it
Hmm.
has to do with what you might describe as at least the functional definition of subject
Hmm.
versus predicate, right? That to a certain extent, what subject means is simply determinability,
Hmm.
right? So if I say that, like, the subject is um, whatever, I suppose if we're talking at a kind of abstract level, the subject is pure determinability. Well, that is a synthesis, but the predicate
Hmm.
flows out of the nature of the subject itself, right? Because the subject is nothing more than determinability.
Right.
So if I say subject means determinable, but perhaps not yet determined, uh, then there are some kind of interesting things. I mean, one, there's already what we just mentioned, the self-predication, the self-synthesis kind of thing. The other thing about it has to do with the fact of determinability means the absence of actual determination.
Mm-hmm.
It's merely potential at that point.
Mm,
And so, as a sort of pure potentiality, and a pure potentiality that flows out of the nature of the term itself, there's an absence of external limitation, external restriction,
mm-hmm.
right? And that is a necessary condition for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That, freedom, autonomy, on the picture of most of the German idealists, has kind of two aspects to it, a negative and a positive aspect. The negative aspect is freedom from external determination and
Mm-hmm.
freedom to determine oneself by one's own nature.
Mm,
Right. And so, like, reason for Kant is the paradigm of autonomy because autonomy or reason has a kind of force to it. It has a determining force to it. Like, if you do a syllogism with universal quantifiers or whatever, you're kind of obligated to reach, if there are two true premises, then you're kind of obligated to reach a true conclusion. But what is that
mm-hmm.
obligation? What is that force? It's something that
Mm,
flows out of the nature of reason itself,
mm,
right? It's that kind of thing. So for Kant,
yeah.
that's more or less the paradigm of autonomy understood in its positive aspect, which is to say something about its nature um, that determines itself. So, autonomy literally means self-legislating, or
Mm-hmm.
giving oneself the law instead of having laws placed on you from outside. If there's something about a subject or a reason or whatever that gives the law itself out of its own nature, then that is positive freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not saying that it's not freedom only understood in terms of libertarianism, where, nobody can tell me what to do, but I still don't know what to do. It's just that nobody's telling me, So that's the negative part of it. That's the absence of external determination. But freedom, autonomy needs this internal determinability as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so in Maimon's analysis of the subject as itself a synthesis, he gets at least half of that. I mean, it's not totally clear if determinability is enough of a sort of positive project to call it positive freedom.
Yeah.
That's where Fichte comes in this book anyway. I'm not sure if Maimon says anything about autonomy flowing out of the nature of the subject or not, but in this book, the stronger formulation of the positive project of freedom that flows out of the nature of the subject is when I think it's Fichte, yes, Fichte describes the I am as an imperative,
Mm,
right? Not just a description,
yeah.
but rather it's an order, it's a command
y- Yeah.
saying I am. We're not quite there yet, but I hope at least it's clear that there are a couple things going on. One, hopefully the idea of the self-synthetic nature of the subject kind of shows you how you can get the I am, at least formally, without a predicate, without an external predicate, because the
Mm-hmm.
am dot 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 is itself already a predicate that is open-ended.
Mm-hmm.
It's still just pure potentiality, but it also flows out of the nature of the subject. And then with respect to the idea of the category mistake, one of the ways that Fichte talks about sentences like "man is free" or "that
Mm-hmm.
is beautiful" as being infinite judgments is to say that uh, when we truly understand a concept like humanity, quote unquote man or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
all people or whatever, humanity, um, that there's a sense in which um, the nature of humanity can never be exhausted by a list of external predicates,
Mm,
right? So, like if I
hmm
say, I'm a white male American who's 48 years old and lives, there's still going to be some excess to me, which means that there's something about me which d d either, can't be exhausted by its predicates or is in some sense totally other than at least external predication,
Yeah.
right? Because if it weren't totally other than, I suppose you could get a complete and adequate description on a predicative level of any given person or of humanity itself or of freedom itself, right? But there's this
Mm-hmm.
idea that humanity understood from the point of view of autonomy, this kind of whatever metaphysical freedom, I guess we could say, or at least
Hmm.
practical freedom, um, that there is something totally other about it, which prevents it from adequately being covered, or you could say exhausted, but I think covered is another way to think of like when I say that, okay, I've got an S and I want to cover all aspects of the S, and so I just start slapping predicates on it. Um, there's a sense that the S can never fully be covered by those predicates,
Hmm.
right? That there's always an excess to it. And that excess
Yeah.
is what prevents it from um, simply being exhausted by or adequately contained in its predicates,
Hmm.
and so that's why man is free. And I suppose that free also has the same, like you could do it with freedom is,
Yep.
I think.
Right.
And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that man is free is on some level a tautology, I suppose,
Right.
just in the way that S is determinability is a tautology,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because freedom flows out of the nature of the subject term,
Right.
right? And so it's like this sort of self-predication.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so this applies only to, does it apply to like all objects? Like when I say water is cold, um, is coldness already sort of like an
Well,
internal
yeah, I mean,
aspect?
Hegel is going to argue something kind of like that, except it's not about the object, it's about what's going on subjectively when we judge water is cold,
Mm,
right? And it has to do with the idea that and I'm not totally sure if Hegel's making a logical error or not. At first, it seemed like there's a fallacy going on with respect to what the is in the sentence "water is cold." Is it an identity statement or is it a predicative statement? But I suppose one way of thinking about how predication is wrapped up with identity statements is that an identity statement is just a complete predicative statement.
mm,
Is it clear what I'm saying? Like if so, I could say, for instance, um, I don't know, you're a graduate of the University of Washington,
mm-hmm,
and that's true as a predicate, but it's certainly not true as an identity statement because there are lots of graduates of the University of Washington, so it doesn't pick you out, and also you have a lot more predicates than just being a graduate of the University of Washington. Right.
mm-hmm,
So just having one predicate there certainly is not an identity statement. But if I wanted to pick out you precisely, I could either, I guess, give a complete extensional list of all your predicates,
mm,
or I could give some kind of definitional predication where I give the jointly necessary and sufficient conditions that constitute you as a unique entity,
mm.
right?
So would my name suffice then as an identity?
Um, Yeah, it depends on how we're interpreting
Mm,
what names are doing. That's why
yeah.
with anything that could have a proper name, it's a little more complicated. But even so, I think the name would still just be a shortcut for a denotative description.
Mm,
In other words,
yeah.
those predicates that pick out all and only you. Well, there's only one of
Right.
you, but um, but you know, the idea though is that identity is in
Mm-hmm.
some sense just complete predication. And I don't necessarily, it's not necessarily, I mean, it could be complete predication if it's really just every single property, or it could be adequate predication, which means to say a definition,
Mm-hmm.
right? But predication and identity are bound up with each other. And so
Mm-hmm.
what Hegel says is when you say like uh that rose is red, that's an affirmative judgment, but contained within the affirmative judgment is also the recognition of a negation. The idea that actually red is not identical to the rose, right? That the rose, um, for one thing, just has other properties in addition to being red. Um, Now, it's kind of interesting if you think about a definitional predication, right? Because red is
Mm-hmm.
not the definition of rose.
Right.
But if you, I don't know, like if you do like a triangle or something, or a circle, it's a one line shape where every point on the line is equidistant from the center or something like that, right? You know, some
Mm-hmm.
kind of definition like that. Um, I guess it's true. So, you know, on one level, that could be an adequate definition. I suppose you'd have the problem of saying, well, yeah, but circles also have more predicates than just their definitional predicates. But
Mm-hmm.
even so, I mean, I think the idea would have to be like, even if you could list out a complete extension of all the predicates, including the definitional ones, there would still be more to the subject term because
Yep.
the subject, in addition to its properties, is also it has the function of unifying those properties, right? And so the unification itself is never captured in the list of predicates. It's so
Mm-hmm.
you might even think of S not as an entity, but as a function that ranges over predicates.
Yeah.
It's a unification function or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the predicates can never fully exhaust the subject because the subject, in addition to all its predicates, is also that which unifies the predicates, that which is required for those predicates to inhere in something, you know?
Yeah.
And so there, any predicate or, you know, any subject term would always have an excess, just like humanity has an excess. But there, I guess it's not really so much the object that has the excess, it's a moment of the affirmative judgment that reveals that it's not adequate, it's not complete.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I liked your example of man is free, where they can both act as subjects that are infinitely predicable and
Well,
sort of kind of make
as
it.
I said, I think that Fichte, I haven't read enough Fichte to know if this holds up, but I think he would just say that that's essentially a tautology.
Yeah.
It's a tautology, however, of a particular form that Hegel develops a little bit. They don't talk about this in this chapter, but Hegel has this concept of the concrete universal.
Mm-hmm.
And one way of interpreting, so at the end of the Hegel chapter, he starts talking about how the infinite judgment, once you go through the category mistake, it also has its mirror image in the tautology. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you know, you could say spirit is not a pineapple, and that's trivially, I mean, that's trivially true, but only because it's nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also say spirit is spirit, which is
Mm-hmm.
trivially true because it's a tautology.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that as a tautology, it's kind of interesting because there's this dual function to spirit, both as subject and predicate there. And one way of interpreting that is that spirit's a bad example because it's kind of abstract or something. But you know, if I say Sandesh is Sandesh, to a certain extent, that can only be true after you have lived,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you're not fully Sandesh yet in the sense of being the concept of Sandesh in its fullest form.
Mm-hmm.
It's only through having the specific life that you have that the subject Sandesh achieves the predicate Sandesh,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so, I think that you can sort of see man is free as that kind of tautology, that it is a specific, species or even entity. I mean, the thing about man is free, um, I guess since that is a statement at the species level, it also means that Sandish is free,
Hmm.
right? Um, but it's complicated because, at least according to Fichte, none of us can ever truly achieve um, the conceptual purity of freedom in our action. I mean, it's always there as something that we increasingly strive for, or maybe even develop if we're successful, but we never actually reach we never reach the point in this life where we are uh, a fully adequate instance of the concept freedom, right?
Right.
Or of the predicate freedom, even though that's flowing from our own nature,
Right.
right? And if you could, then that would be an example of being a concrete universal, because
Hmm.
there's would be a sense in saying if you could achieve absolute freedom like that, it would be like saying that specific person, that concrete individual, is identical to the universal freedom,
Yeah.
right? It's something like that, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Last time we met, you said something like life is sort of a realization or like accumulation of like knowledge of freedom. Because like we never really fully realize freedom, but it's like the sort of slow sort of like learning or whatever of what freedom
yeah,
is, but we never really get to that
yeah.
ultimate infinity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, okay, so there are a couple of things that are important about this. One, I'll just say exactly what Fichte has to say about that. He says that man must approximate ad infinitum, to infinity. He must approximate to a freedom he can never in principle attain,
Hmm.
because it's flowing out of your nature, but it's also infinite and we're finite.
Hmm.
However, we approximate to infinity in our own finite ways. But now, one thing that is important about this is that this is where the positive project of freedom comes from, where it's not just an absence of external restrictions, it is a guiding principle that shows you what to do in your own action. He says, it is a task of my mind, derived from the positing of myself, to discover this ideal of freedom, though it is a task that could only be discharged after a completed approximation to the infinite. So,
Hmm.
what he's saying is that how do you, yeah, I'm not sure if I said, a life is like accumulating knowledge. I think I probably said it in a more abstract way. A life means accumulating predicates,
Hmm.
right? In other words, you're born and you have a few predicates out of the gate, I guess, but mostly you acquire predicates through doing things in the world, right? And so, how would one achieve the I suppose the full or adequate form of their freedom? It would have to be through the actions they perform, the choices they make, etc., right? It's not enough to simply have it as a static property, right? Because for one thing, you're pulled in all sorts of other directions, and you sort of have to prove through your action your freedom, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but then that means that it's an imperative. It's a command to act in accordance with your own nature as autonomous subject, and not your nature simply as a being in the chain of cause and effect,
Hmm.
right? However, just because freedom as a concept has the structure of the infinite judgment, it always reaches beyond. Uh,
Hmm.
and so it's always going to be an approximation, which is
Hmm.
not to say that it's false, but
Mm,
it's like a disposition that can never be actualized, at least in
mm,
this finite world in our lives.
mm,
So, yeah, I mean, that's important for a few things, a few reasons. One way that I have described freedom in this outline is to borrow from Kant. I think of it as a concept. No, I write here in German, konzeptmäßig ohne Konzept, but what that means is uh, conceptual but not a concept, in the same sense that Kant has purposiveness with no purpose. All of these things have the same basic structure. It turns out that you can get um, an analysis of subjective universality and disinterestedness that has the same basic form, but you can kind of think of these things as dispositions, which means modal properties, but modal properties that um, for us are never realizable.
mm.
And I talked about this with respect to Suzanne Langer some months ago
Right.
too, because she has the same idea with respect to meaning in an artwork, right?
Mm,
That what does it mean to say that X has the disposition to A, some disposition, and yet that disposition cannot in principle be actualized?
mm,
Um, Without positing some kind of beyond, it's impossible for that to not just be false or self-contradictory, right? In other words, if I say that this glass has the disposition to break, however, there are no conditions, at least within the material or finite world or whatever, there are no conditions under which it would break,
mm,
then I don't really understand what it means to say it has the disposition to break because those conditions are impossible,
mm,
right? And that's different from saying that, it has a disposition under certain conditions, but those conditions had never happened before, but they could in principle happen such that it
mm,
would break. Then you could still
mm,
see it as a disposition that has never been actualized, but could be actualized. But the thing about all this stuff with, um, what does she call it? Unconsummated meaning or purposiveness without purpose, or this idea of freedom in Fichte, they're all kind of ideals. They're all kind of, for me to say that uh, freedom is an imperative, I have to. So one way to look at it is, sometimes with Kant and moral imperatives, there is the assumption that ought implies can. Have you ever heard that before?
mm.
Ought implies can.
Yeah.
So in other words, if I ought to do something, it must be possible for me to do it. Otherwise, how could I ought to do it?
Yeah. Yeah.
However, with these things, at least with respect to the finite world, ought does not imply can,
Mm,
right? Because
yeah.
it's still true that you ought to act in accordance with your freedom, but you can never actually achieve your freedom. Or a work of art ought to um, be the sort of thing to which you could ascribe meaning, except that you can't ascribe meaning, right? So, or that you ought to ascribe meaning to, but you can't ascribe meaning to it, at least in this
Mm,
finite world,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's the nature of these kinds of uh, these you could call them modalities or something, right?
Mm,
Freedom and Fichte as a concept like thing with no concept or purposiveness without purpose or whatever. Instead of simply saying that the disposition is not there at all, we say it's there, but not for us in this finite
mm,
world,
mm-hmm.
right? But then the thing is that we're able, presumably because we do have concepts of the infinite,
Right.
and perhaps even our nature as free beings is like a window out to. the infinite. That's why it's I am dot dot dot. It's pure
Hmm.
potentiality reaching to infinity, but we also have the problem that we're finite, and so we can never
Hmm.
fully conceptualize freedom to ourselves or any kind of infinite thing. Um, However, we can nonetheless have some kind of intimation of it. It can be an ideal for us, even though we can never actually bring it about.
Yeah. Hmm. So this is kind of like utopia, and it's maybe the same sort of.
Yeah, I think that perfection generally has that structure, although it depends on how we're defining perfection, because I could simply say that a perfect triangle is one that has three sides and, whatever. I mean, um, maybe the corollaries fall straight out of that, that it has three
Yeah.
angles and those angles equal 180 degrees and whatever. If I have a pretty strictly limited concept, then I can get
Mm.
perfection, at least conceptually, quite easily,
Mm.
right? But then it's only a perfect instantiation of that limited concept.
Yeah.
But if you have an infinite concept, like freedom
Mm.
or whatever, then you can't actually get to a perfect instance of it.
Mm.
And actually, this is significant for beauty for Fichte. Couple things to say about beauty. I presume that beauty, just like freedom, is always going to yield a category mistake if you try to um, either use it as a predicate to some material object or, apply some material predicate to beauty as the subject of a judgment or something, because it is this sort of self-predicating beyond, it's this idea that kind of reaches
Mm.
beyond or whatever. But one thing about beauty for Kant, one of the things that comes out of Kant's claim that beauty does not involve concepts, judgments of beauty do not involve determinate concepts, is that therefore beauty cannot involve perfection. Beauty has nothing to do with perfection.
Mm.
Because, according to Kant, the definition of perfection requires a concept for an object to be an adequate instantiation of, right? In other
Yeah.
words, how could you have a perfect triangle without the concept triangle?
Right.
Yeah, something like that. But I think that what Fichte's idea here with treating a judgment of beauty as an infinite judgment allows is now we can bring perfection in, but perfection is
Mm.
going to have the same kind of structure as, say, purposiveness without purpose, this disposition that points to a beyond that is not actualizable for us. So you could say that uh, against Kant, what Fichte would claim is that beauty is a perfection because it is conceptually limited, but its concept is infinite. Beauty as
Mm.
a concept and an object as being a perfect instantiation of this concept stretches beyond our finite cognition and intuition, right? So that um, just like I can say that, you know, you can be an instance of freedom, even though you're not perfect freedom. You're not an example of perfect freedom or something like that. Um, Nonetheless, there's a sense that the concept of freedom as an imperative requires this idea of a perfection, of the capacity maybe in the beyond to uh, achieve a perfection with respect to freedom. And I think that you can do the same thing with beauty. You simply treat beauty as a concept that we can never fully cognize to ourselves because of its infinite nature.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that perfection has nothing to do with it. It's simply that perfection, as we encounter it in beauty, is this sense of something that reaches beyond what we can actually comprehend or perceive.
Yeah. Yeah,
I think I talked about that book by Rachel Zuckert, Beauty or a Kant on Beauty and Biology. It came out 10 years ago or 15 years ago or so.
ah,
Because I was reading that and I had a lot of these thoughts a few years ago. And now that I am reading Fichte, it's like they all feel kind of justified because, there are similar ideas here in Fichte. But this idea that,
yeah.
when you're talking about, for instance, purposiveness without purpose, you could understand or beauty as a non-conceptual concept. You can think of purposiveness as a future-oriented, non-discursive concept that is a proxy for the aesthetic object's cause. What she says is that when we encounter purposiveness without purpose, it's an anticipation of a whole that would be like a perfection that
Hmm.
we do not completely understand according to our preconceived categories, right? So I guess the categories of the understanding limit knowledge in a certain way. However, the concept of beauty um, is not the sort of thing that can be exhausted by those concepts, the concepts of
Yeah.
the categories of the understanding. And so it's not that we just have no apprehension of beauty or perfection or purposiveness at all. We do
Hmm.
have some apprehension of it, but we can never have a complete apprehension of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that while beauty is like this net idea, that it still attaches to like a singular object. Like when I say that is beautiful,
Hmm.
there is like a limit because, well, concept too, right? Because when I say that, it's limited,
Hmm.
but then beauty is sort of unlimited or something.
Hmm.
Um, but also, I'm not exhausting the object with beauty because beauty is inexhaustible or whatever. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose, first of all, I think Fichte as well as Kant would both claim that beauty is not a predicate of the object, right?
mhm,
So it is a little bit different in that respect because it's not an objective judgment. It's actually a property of the act of judging itself,
yeah.
right? And so really when you're saying that is beautiful, actually what you're saying is that is an occasion for me to encounter my own beauty, right? And in fact, Kant does talk about the object as an occasion for a judgment of beauty, but not as a cause, right?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so really any judgment of beauty, I guess they would say there's a kind of error in it, which is that we're attributing beauty as a property to an object, but in actuality, we know that it's not a property of the object because beauty is bound up with a particular sort of pleasure, and the pleasure is not in the object, the pleasure is in us,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so it functions a little bit differently from the account in Hegel of, I mean, to a certain extent, it's not that different just because in Hegel, what he's really saying is not that predicates never exhaust the subject term of the object, right? It's not that the object is somehow um, more than, I mean, actually, I'm not sure if this is correct. I might be wrong, but I take Hegel to be saying that when I say the rose is red, but then I also realize that that's not adequate to the rose, really what I'm discovering is something about my own power to judge and not really much about the rose, right? So if that's true, then that's similar to a judgment of beauty, wherein
Yeah.
um, it's not that the object itself is, um, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to figure that out because actually then you start to get into some territory with the thing in itself, and then
Mm,
you'd have to start bringing in questions of intellectual intuition. And so with Hegel, I'm not sure because he might be saying that you know, the object as noumenon does extend beyond our concepts of it in perception, but then we have the power through reason to discover the the objective essence, right? So in other words, reason enables me to understand that when I say the rose is red, there's more to the rose than I could ever predicate of it or something like that. But then if I'm able
yeah.
to understand that, then I have somehow grasped its noumenal essence to an extent. Because
Mm,
one big difference between Hegel and Kant is that Kant uh, rejects the possibility of intellectual intuition. Is it clear what intellectual intuition is?
um, it's not a
You know how
well, it's not
Kant,
pure intuition.
no, you know how Kant says that any knowledge claim requires two sources, thinking and
Yeah.
perceiving, and
Yeah.
that there's always this kind of disconnect between them. They aren't
Hmm.
adequate to each other. So that's why synthesis is involved. Synthesis involves bringing together two different modes of knowing.
Right. Right.
Um, whereas, like analytic knowledge comes straight from the mind, but synthetic knowledge involves perception and intellection,
Yeah.
the intellect and the intuition. And these things in us, because we're finite beings, for whatever reason, they never fully sync up.
Mm,
So, you know, what an intellectual intuition, however, would be something where, like, just purely by thinking, you're able to have a complete real knowledge of some
mm,
entity, right? Not
mm,
not through sensation, not through intuition at all, but rather intuition and intellection are the same thing. So that would be like a divine consciousness. But because we have that kind of disconnect, that's one of the reasons that purposiveness can never have a purpose for us because the purpose itself is never going to be an object in our intuition.
mm,
It doesn't have that intuitive aspect to it.
mm,
It only has an intellectual aspect to it. And so therefore it's not an object of knowledge for Kant.
mm,
It might be an idea of reason or something, but it's not something that we can have objective knowledge, where objective means knowledge of its real existence as an object.
yeah.
But Hegel thinks that we can have that because he
Mm,
rejects the idea that sensation uh, and cognition are somehow exclusive of each other, right? Or somehow like, ill-fitted. He thinks that through intellection we can have complete adequate knowledge. And that
mm,
has to do with this idea of spirit developing self-awareness, self-knowledge,
mm,
so that the knowledge that we have um, as it becomes more aware of itself, it starts to encompass all of material reality as well. And so there is, at least in principle, a point at which spirit, as reason here, could have a complete self-knowledge. And this complete
mm,
self-knowledge would be uh, the I don't even want to say the synthesis of intuition and understanding. It's really an understanding that these are the same things,
mm,
right? Um,
mm.
However, because of our finite place and so on, we do have to go through a process of merging them together.
Yeah.
But at the end state, they would, it's complicated. They would preserve their distinction while also being absolutely unified. At least with respect to things like subject, object, and so on, material, spiritual, and this kind of thing. He does claim at various points that the sublated unity of, say, subject, which you could think of as perhaps understanding, and object as perhaps intuition, or is at least related to these things, when they are finally sublated into a unity, they still have this sort of um, distinctiveness about them, even though they're
Mm,
perfectly integrated.
hmm hmm
Um,
Yeah, the pleasure, well, Kant says that the pleasure that arises out of beauty is like from our recognition of the harmony between intuition and understanding. Like from that
mhm,
harmony is
mhm,
what the pleasure arises. And I saw this like I forget what it was in some secondary literature where they posited that in the logical form. S is in bracket S is P.
mhm.
So that's like the subject realizing that they're able to bring together intuition and understanding.
What is the S that is not in brackets in that?
I
I'm
guess
just curious.
the
Yeah,
sub oh
is it the
yeah.
subject or is it? Yeah, maybe it's. Let me think about that for a second. I guess beauty is the in brackets SSP, perhaps something like that. Maybe I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to read more about what is being diagrammed in that way because I think it is important to understand the P is not external, and that's not necessarily obvious in just saying S is in brackets SSP. Um, but yeah, it is kind of interesting to think of SSP, like if you think of SSP in brackets as itself just a P,
Yeah.
but it's a unified P that is S as P,
hmm
just in the way that for Maimon, for instance, the subject just is pure determinability or
Right.
something, right? Then I could perhaps see that as being
Yeah.
an analysis of it, maybe. We should move on though to try
Yeah.
to jump through a few things. The last thing that I want to mention about Fichte is that you can kind of see the way that German idealism played a role for the early pragmatists
hmm
in Fichte's work. In Hegel's work, it's maybe fairly obvious too. But here, one of the things that's interesting is the way that you can think of this foundational principle, the I am, not as a description, but as something like a speech act, right?
mm
Or a thought act, if maybe it's not uttered or whatever. But this idea that saying I am, there are a lot of interesting things about this. For one thing, it is not describing a state of affairs. In its utterance, it brings about a state of affairs.
mm
And you can see that for a few reasons. I mean, for one thing, uh, I am is self-referential. And so in uttering itself, it also is its own cause. It brings itself
mm
about in its utterance because of its
hmm
self-reference.
mm
But then one of the things that's interesting is that it's not really a proposition, right?
hmm
I mean, it sort of has the form, excuse me, it has the form of a proposition, and it could be interpreted as a proposition or a description, but it can only be interpreted as a description after the fact because it
hmm
doesn't exist until it utters itself.
Yeah.
I guess a couple things that should be said about this. I am, at least for Schelling, I was reading that for Schelling, this I am as this self-causing first principle is only true of the absolute I am and
mm
not of just any run-of-the-mill subjective I am. So that every time I say I am, I'm causing myself or something. Really, it's more like the absolute. maybe general nature of I am as a self-referential speech act.
mm, mm-hmm,
So it's actually fairly interesting, right?
mm-hmm.
Like, you know what I mean by speech act, first of all, right? Is that clear?
Is it just the act of utterance, or is it like,
No, I mean it's related to that, but like for instance, if I say class has now started,
mm,
that wasn't a description. It brought about the fact of class beginning by my saying
mm,
it. Or if I say, I
mm,
promise to pay you $5. Until I said that, there was no state of affairs of me having this obligation to pay you $5. It's only
mm,
in the saying of it that that state of affairs comes about.
mm,
And normally, with like propositional sentences, the fact is primary and the proposition about the fact is secondary. But in speech acts, the speech act is primary and the state of affairs comes out of the speech act,
mm,
right? So like, whenever there are all sorts of things like this. Whenever someone gets married and they say I do or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's like typically they tend to be things, states of affairs that have social ontologies,
mm,
right? However, I guess if maybe that's obvious just because of the fact that there's speech acts and speech is necessarily social or something like this.
mm-hmm.
But the thing about I am is a very special kind of speech act because the state of affairs that it brings about is its own existence
Yeah,
because it's self-referential.
yeah. It sort of reminds me of when you start up a Microsoft desktop, the ta-da thing sound in the beginning.
I suppose,
um,
except, yeah, I mean, I suppose that that would be kind of a semiotic speech act or something. And I suppose
mhm,
that, speech act, the thing that is distinctive about speech acts is that they still have a kind of Um, well, here's one thing that I think it's Searle, or maybe J.L. Austin was the first one who came up with this distinction, but I know that Searle uses this distinction that speech acts have both perlocutionary and illocutionary content. In other words, they have both a kind of propositional form, but
mm,
they also have that performative aspect.
mhm,
Whereas da-da only has the performative. There's no propositional content to it. There's nothing about the form that's propositional.
mhm,
Right. And
mhm,
so, you can have states of affairs that are brought about by presentational forms, to use Langer's term, gestures or sounds or whatever. But speech acts are significant um, because of the kind of propositional form of them, they also describe the state of affairs that they're bringing about.
yeah, yeah,
Right. Um,
mm,
yeah. And in addition to that, a sentence like I am not only does it describe the state of affairs, it is the state of affairs that it brings about. It's like because of its self-reference,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But one of the things
mm,
that's really important about that is then we start to see thought as a specific kind of action,
mhm,
right? So just like we were talking about Rorty, and you could go back to John Dewey or whoever, for the pragmatists, they want to overcome this false distinction between thought and action,
yeah,
and say that all thought is action. Everything is action, essentially, right?
mhm, mhm,
And here we see that in Fichte, that there are all sorts of aspects of the I am as a speech act, as an imperative, as the sort of thing that could only be instantiated in action, freedom,
mm,
right? This kind of thing. There are all these examples of thought as being activity. And
mhm,
this is important for Hegel because for Hegel, that means that if you think of activity under two aspects. One, that it necessarily involves change. If you don't have change, you can't have activity. But
Hmm.
then also that it typically, although I guess not necessarily, but it typically involves a material component, right?
Mm.
That it's not just pure, like, whatever, thought. That
Yeah.
activity means bringing about change in the world, in material reality, right? But
Hmm.
that's what thought does. The thought really is that kind of material change. Maybe it's not entirely material, but it has a material correlate and it necessarily involves change. And that's pretty distinct from, say, the Platonic picture of thought, right?
Mm.
As, you know, eternal truths that, when they're completely adequate, never change.
Yeah.
And that's why I think with absolute knowing, which is what we might describe as the point in which spirit and therefore the world, but the point at which spirit achieves the um, the status of being like a concrete universal where it is a manifestation of its own concept, right?
Hmm.
That's why one way of describing that state is the unity, say, of subject and object, or of mind and world, or these other sorts of dichotomies. It, thought reaches a unity there, but it's a unity that nonetheless contains the distinctions that led up to it. Because
Hmm.
what you need is, if you want to think of thought as essentially involving some kind of change, then the point at which thought spirit achieves its final form or its final synthesis, it has to also incorporate difference within it, even though that difference is fully unified, is fully contained in the unity, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, all it would be a kind of delayed Platonism,
Hmm.
right? Because, oh, okay, we're developing to a final form where we have unchanging eternal truths. That's not quite the right picture. What you might think of as absolute knowing as a eternal unity of distinctions that are both distinct and yet unified.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is, as laid out in the chapter, a place where judgment, thought in terms of judgment breaks down,
Mm.
because it doesn't really make much sense to say that it is both eternal and yet changing, or maybe say changing and yet static, or
Yeah.
distinct and yet unified, that it contains distinctions and yet it's unified and so on. Those seem like paradoxes or something.
Yeah.
And so Heller Roizen claims that the gateway to that sort of development of spirit, of thinking, is the infinite judgment as a category mistake, as nonsense. Because then
Hmm.
judgment, because of its internal contradictions, breaks down, and you no longer have thought as judgment. You sort of have pure thought, where
Mm.
where components can be distinct and yet thoroughly unified.
Yeah. Mm.
But in any case, I mean, the really important thing here is to think of thought as activity. And this is
Yeah.
something that leads to that particular way of thinking about thought in pragmatism.
Pragmatism. Hmm.
Well, shall we try to tackle Hegel?
Yeah. We have like 20 minutes.
Oh, you have to leave at what, at 9?
Yeah.
Okay.
To go to the temple today.
Oh, I see. Which temple are you going to?
It's uh it's by Bothell.
Yeah, I know that one. You know,
Yeah.
I always wanted to go in there, but I was always kind of afraid that I'd be like the weird white guy that doesn't know any of the customs. So, um,
No, I
I
mean I've seen
tourists,
yeah.
really? I mean, I drive by there pretty. I live pretty close to that.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah, if you
yeah.
ever want to go, I'd go with you.
Oh, yeah. We should go. I want to go
Yeah.
inside. So maybe not
Yeah.
today, but next time you go,
Yeah.
send me an email and I'll
Okay.
drop by. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, let's see. I don't know. So you did read the Hegel chapter, is that correct? Or did you not get to
Yeah,
it
I read it a week ago. I mean,
a week ago?
I can read it again and just have a better
I mean, we have covered a
understanding of the
lot of it
context.
out of order. Trying to think what we can pull from this that is the most important. Maybe I'll just go really quickly through what I've got here and stop me if you have a question or something's not clear. I can
Hmm.
probably jump over a lot of this because we've covered it today. But okay, so one big difference between, say, Kant and Aristotle and Hegel is that Hegel wants reason to essentially be self-producing.
Hmm.
I mean, you do see that in Kant and the notion of autonomy as giving the law to itself and so on. But one thing that's kind of interesting about the critique of pure reason in the table of judgments is that he doesn't actually, um, at least the way he presents them at first. I suppose you can put together an argument for how he derives the concepts of the understanding, but the way that he presents them uh, in the table of categories is just to say these are the traditional categories of logic,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so Hegel's complaint there is that it just treats logic as this static set of truths or this static set of logical forms or something that uh, is to where the relationships are kind of arbitrary. Like there's a kind of
Hmm.
mosaic. It's like, what does the hypothetical judgment have to do with the infinite judgment or whatever,
Hmm.
And what Hegel wants to do is put them into this developing sequence where so for the first category, he changes the order of the categories in Kant. In Kant, it's what is it? It's quantity, quality, relation, modality. That's the order that he. And also, one of the things that's interesting is in the Critique of Pure Reason, he has a table of categories in a
Hmm.
cross form, if you remember. It's like one, two, three, four,
Yeah, three
which
each or
suggests
something.
which suggests that
Yeah.
he's thinking about logic geometrically
Yeah.
and not sequentially as a process, but
Mm.
as like a non-temporal shape or something,
Hmm.
right? And Hegel doesn't
Hmm.
have a table of categories. Hegel has a sequential story about how one category gives rise to the next.
Mm.
So already there you see some pretty big distinctions, right? That Hegel
Mm.
is trying to make logic come alive. He's treating
Yeah.
logic from the point of view of a living, developing structure. And maybe structure is not
Mm.
even the right word, process or whatever, right? But this idea that he's bringing development into the notion of logic, not as one way of saying this is that I said a second ago that if absolute knowing were really just like a Platonic world of forms, static, unchanging, true for all eternity, then there might be some development in our understanding of the forms, but that
Hmm.
development is not essential to truth or to logic itself. It's just like,
Hmm.
an incomplete understanding of the Platonic forms, and then we reach the Platonic forms.
Hmm.
But what Hegel wants to do is make that aspect of process an essential feature of reason itself, right? And so it's not just about um, reason, uh, like when you were 12 years old, you didn't know anything about logic, and then you started reading logic textbooks, and then you start to develop a better understanding of logic. That's not what's going on with Hegel. With Hegel,
Mm.
what he's showing is, or trying to show anyway, is that there is this essential feature of growth, life, development to reason,
Mm.
right? Um, and so, he thinks of it as a dynamic, self-organizing activity. And one of the things about this is that there is no real distinction between form and content, that
Mm.
the content is born out of the form, but form is really just one more way of thinking about the content of reason. Now, an important thing here with respect to judgment is that um, this only works in German as far as I know, because I was looking up the etymology of the word judgment in English and in Romance languages and stuff, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But in German, judgment is Urteil, which means primary distinction or primary
Mm,
separation.
right.
And so, I mean, a couple of things could be said about that. One thing is that Hegel thinks that spirit as it develops brings about material forms. So, like for instance, you might have abstract ideas of what's right, but those are never quite as true or as adequate to spirit's development as actual legal systems or actual societies.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say that one thing that Hegel would be committed to is this idea that um, rather than treating logic as an abstract set of principles, irrespective of how it's deployed in language, that
Mm-hmm.
as spirit develops, it brings about language. And so the material forms of logic in language are actually more adequate to spirit than the abstract, say, symbolic logic. Is it clear
Mm.
what I'm saying?
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Okay, let me put it this way. Okay, so like the word in German for judgment is Urteil. And then we would want to ask, okay, so that word in German has a meaning, it means primary distinction or separation,
Distinction.
but most languages don't have that etymology for the same logical function.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what we want to ask is what is more adequate to the truth? A sort
Mm.
of abstract logical function that's universal across languages, or a real material way that thinking people deploy reason in actual language.
Mm.
Is it clear what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
And since Hegel does have this idea that spirit as it develops brings about these logical forms that are actually at a higher level of development than the mere abstract or completely general forms, he could claim that German is just the best language for doing philosophy because it unveils this aspect of reason, right?
Mm.
Actually, Heidegger has a very similar kind of idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger talks about language as the house of being
Mm.
that you never get. I mean, you can have abstractions that are really pretty empty, that are just like, dead bones. But if you want to think of reason, spirit as a living process that in its self-actualization infuses all reality or brings about the material world in its specific forms, then you're going to want to claim that, abstract symbolic logic is just dead. The
Yeah.
real living logic is how it's used, right? In actual language, for instance,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So you can also see a kind of pragmatism there, which is kind of interesting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But in any case, what Hegel claims here is that, really the sort of first condition of spirit is the synthetic unit. Well, he might not even use the word synthetic, but he does say that Kant's unity of apperception is the original unity of spirit before it has begun its self-actualization.
Mm.
So, in other words, one way of looking at this is, Kant says that all experience is unified, and that's a function of our transcendental ego, you know. But then if we want to start to say things about the world or even ourselves, talk about the mind itself, we have to use judgment, which then splits that unity into subject and object,
Mm.
right? And so, I suppose one thing that Hegel would say here is also that, it's not just that he's a German chauvinist, even though he was a German nationalist and chauvinist, or at least Prussian or whatever. But he could also say that words like judgment that really just derive from the word law, this
Mm,
unchanging truth or this absolute, strict truth or something. The German word actually captures something really necessary about thinking that isn't there in the word law, which is the idea that
mm,
you move from a state of absolute unity, the unity of apperception. But if you want to make your experience an object of knowledge, then you have to split it apart into subject and object,
yeah.
right? And so thinking requires if you have that first level of unity between subject and object, you can't know anything.
Hmm.
Because in order to know something, subjectivity has to have something to be known,
Right.
right? Otherwise, you're
Yeah.
just kind of not even conscious, right?
Yep. Yep. Mm,
And so that's the fundamental separation of the judgment. The
mm.
splitting even of consciousness into an object for itself. Um,
So he agrees with Kant, at least on that note, that there is like this unity of a perception or whatever
mhm.
as like this primordial unity that is then split. So I guess he's with Kant there, but then he deviates when Kant gets too
Well,
attached to the categories and
yeah, it's interesting because, well, I mean, there are a couple things there. For one, Kant doesn't believe that we can ever have in our finite lives a healing of the separation. That's
mm,
something that's beyond our capacity to think because all thinking involves judgment, and judgment involves that separation, S and P, subject, object, etc., right?
mm, mm,
Um, Hegel thinks that we can, through the speculative reason of the highest synthesis of spirit and absolute knowing, we can actually at least glimpse the way that subject and object would be healed, the
mm.
separation. Them would be healed. There's also trying to think with Kant. With Kant is sort of interesting because there is a tradition post Wilfrid Sellars and people like John MacDonald and Robert Brandom and whatnot that treat the copula of those judgments in the table of categories as the act of synthesis and not just as predication, so that those
Mm,
judgments in the table of categories, they're not descriptions of the world. They are,
mhm,
if they're descriptions at all, they're descriptions of the way that we bring the world into our conscious experience.
mhm.
Um, but in any case, if that's true, then I mean, I don't want to say something that's false, but I think one thing that Kant would say is that the unity of apperception. So you can think of judgments as synthetic, but synthesis also means unification,
Yeah,
the unification of S and P in a judgment, right? And
yeah.
so then I think that what Kant would be saying is that the unity of apperception underwrites the capacity of judgments to bring things together,
Hmm.
right? So that there is a unity in the judgment. It's a unity, say, of perception and the intellect or whatever. And these things are distinct, but in the way we deploy judgment when we experience the world, we're bringing, the manifold of all this different stuff into a unity. Now, that's not to say that there are no such things as differences or whatever. It's just that for us, the way that apperception, as it's deployed in judgments, works is to bring all this stuff that is distinct into a unified consciousness.
Mm,
And I think what Hegel does have an idea that's similar to that, but what he really wants to emphasize here is this idea of judgment as a split, right? This idea that He just puts more emphasis on this idea of the distinction, say, between S and P in the judgment, and not necessarily understanding it merely as a synthesis. I don't know, they're
Hmm.
pretty similar in a way. I guess it's just a question about how much they emphasize the splitting aspect of judgment versus the synthetic aspect of judgment. But Hegel does emphasize the synthetic aspect of judgment too, because it's one of the things, judgment is this foundational split in consciousness between subject and
Hmm.
object, from pure
Hmm.
subjectivity, say, where you're not even conscious, to being conscious means a split between subject and object. But
Yeah.
that split, judgment, is actually the vehicle that's going to enable us to finally achieve this higher level synthesis at the end. Absolute
Mm.
knowing, right?
Hmm.
And the basic story that Heller Rosen tells here is that, okay, so, spirit consciousness has to split itself in order to have objects of knowledge. And we get a lot of knowledge out of judgment, SSP and all the things that follow from the various forms of that. Um, but the logic of judgment, going from the affirmative to the negative to the infinite to then like his specific
Hmm.
versions of the infinite judgment that are either nonsensical or tautological, that's a moment that judgment collapses under its own contradictions in the case of the kind of category mistake version of the infinite judgment. Or, so you could think of that as an explosion of
Hmm.
meaning. Or there's also the mirror side of that, which is the implosion of meaning, where the infinite judgment produces tautologies,
Hmm.
right? But in any case, either as a tautology or um, nonsense, there's a failure of judgment to continue providing a vehicle for knowledge. Is that clear?
Towards
And
absolute knowing.
yeah, and so that's why the name of this chapter is Collapsing Sentences,
Mm.
because the infinite judgment is a judgment, except that Hegel says that the infinite judgment is a judgment that is actually not a judgment.
Hmm.
It's a judgment,
Hmm.
ein Urteil, das keiner ist, or something like that. Um,
Hmm.
or, yeah, der keiner ist. But uh, the idea is that there's this internal contradiction, perhaps, in judgment that starts to develop. As you move through affirmative into negative judgments, um, uh, spirit expressed in judgments, reason expressed in judgments can produce knowledge of a particularly discursive type,
Hmm.
but then the internal structure, the internal kind of motor of judgment starts to produce nonsense or
Hmm.
trivial truths, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and then that is supposed to be, according to Heller Rosen, the threshold, the gateway from the insufficient form of spirit as judgment that's all about distinction is supposed to be the turning point where spirit starts to recover itself as a fully unified, uh, absolute knowing where the distinctions between subject and object are overcome and yet are still sort of present in the final unity. And
Hmm.
again, that's not going to make a lot of sense because judgment as a means of making sense of statements has collapsed.
Right.
It sounds fairly mystical there, and maybe it is a little mystical, although
Yeah.
I think you can get a
Yeah.
little bit more precise about what's going on after judgment collapses. And it has
Yeah.
to do again with this idea of the tautology of the positive infinite judgment is not just a normal tautology where, it's the same thing on either side of the equal sign. There is at least a different kind of function to the term. The way that he describes it, so like Hegel says, like one way of describing the status of absolute knowing is a moment where he says, well, the process of moving towards infinite, or rather, absolute knowing is the process of God describe it's the process of revealing or unfolding or unveiling God as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and a finite
Mm,
spirit. But then towards the end, what he says is, see if I can find it here. Oh yes, God is being is
mm,
one way of formulating the kind of synthesis you've got in absolute knowing, where, God is not a thing and being is not a determination of a thing.
yeah.
Rather, God is the essence of being and being is the essence of God.
Hmm.
And there you can kind of see the structure of the concrete universal there, where there is a concrete particular God. There's only one God,
Yeah.
according to Hegel. And for Hegel, he thinks that that is one thing that makes European religion great, that they've finally discovered the truth of. Anyway, but in
Mm,
any case, God is a concrete particular, um, but God is also not a thing because God is just pure being,
yeah.
right? And being can be understood as not something abstract, as something that really has
Yeah.
concrete existence in God, um,
Hmm.
but God as the concrete particular real formulation of being is the essence of being
Hmm.
as concrete, real, existent, and pure being, essence is all that God means. That's the essence of God. And so it's, you know, um, this moment where the tautology, at first, I suppose it's not even totally adequate to say that, like, um, when you live your life to its end, then you have achieved the full instantiation of the concept of who you are or something,
Hmm.
because there I think there's still at least a kind of distinction between subject and predicate. Maybe not. In any case, with God as being, it's supposed to be a moment where there's sort of like a dual aspect here, where you can see God as concrete particular,
Yeah.
or you can see being as essence, but actually they're the same thing. The essence is,
Yeah.
so one way he says it is the universal, the essence being is the particular or is the singular, and the singular is the universal. And
Right.
that's this moment that predication has finally found its absolute expression in an identity statement, I guess,
Hmm.
something like this. Anyway, we went pretty fast. And as I said, if you go too fast with Hegel, it ends up sounding really implausible.
Yeah.
But if you go slowly enough, you can start to see how the reason, there is a very strong sense of necessity. So if we wanted to spend more time with this, I'd try to convince you of these steps in the development of spirit. But I just went through the different like locations without giving you the
Yeah.
connecting fiber. Of course, the
No, no,
thing
no. Yeah.
is, the
It's good.
connecting fiber is what spirit is.
Right. Right.
So,
Right.
um, yeah.
Did you read the rest of the book or
I did not really closely. I just kind of,
okay,
I did read
skimmed
it,
through it?
but there are a lot of things like where if I didn't quite catch what was going on, I just kept going. I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
go
yeah,
back and try
yeah.
to really, tease out what was going on. But yeah, I got to the end.
Okay. I don't know how interesting the rest of the chapters are.
I think the last chapter is kind of interesting because it's, for one thing, a really easy read, and it
Mm,
gives some examples of more contemporary philosophers working with these kinds of questions of, like the assertion of a negative or this kind of thing. But
huh.
I think that the meat of this book is the German idealism stuff,
Yeah.
really what's going on, and then the rest is, the first 8 chapters are like introduction to that, and then the last
Right.
like 4 chapters or whatever just kind of he doesn't really spend very much time with any particular philosopher after this point.
Mm,
So it's always, like some of the earlier chapters where it's like, there are 6 to 12 or so people that he talks about in every chapter.
Yeah.
Um, it makes it easier to
Okay.
read, but it's not quite as meaty as these
Meaty.
chapters.
Okay.
Well, I
Um,
think if we just spent half an hour next time kind of going
yeah.
through the arguments in Hegel a little bit better, I could make it seem more necessary. You
Yeah.
know. Then the other
Cool.
thing to decide is what you want to read next, and I sent you those kind of
Yeah,
anthologies of Indian philosophy.
that'll be good.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at them,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure exactly where to start, except on, page one. I don't know if
Yeah,
there are things
same.
that you see there that you are interested in diving into, or if you just want to kind of. I mean, I need as much introduction as possible because I don't really know very much.
Yeah. The what was this? You sent me two PDFs.
Yeah, one was just kind of like a there are no source readings, there are no sutras or anything in the first one, and then the second one is an actual anthology with the source readings.
Oh, I see.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe the anthology is good, and then we can read the other one as like background secondary literature or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I could look at it closer and see if I can find a good selection of readings, or maybe you could do that and suggest something to me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
All right.
So I'll see you next Thursday at the same
Okay.
time.
Sounds good. 7:30.
Okay.
All
See
right.
ya. All
Bye
right.
bye.
Bye.